Inside a weathered southern diner bathed in the sunlight, a black single mother quietly yet firmly stood up to protect a weary Hell's Angel biker from the threat of 2 armed police officers. That choice made the entire town turn its back on her, but what happened next would bring even the hardest hearts to tears. Inside the small diner, Danielle Parker, a woman in her 30s, carefully wiped down the worn wooden table by the window, as if each stroke on the tablecloth was a prayer for something nameless. Hope, or at least for today not to be too bad. Danielle was a single mother, not the type often glorified on social media with latte coffee and a bright smile. She was the real kind, the one who wakes up at 4 a.m. every day, cleaning, cooking, and weighing every penny in the cash register to scrape together money for medicine for her father, Eli Parker, who had been paralyzed after a stroke 2 years ago. Sometimes, while filling the coffee pot, she'd think about the unpaid bills hanging over her head like rocks. Her 8-year-old son, Caleb, was still asleep in the small room behind the kitchen, where a rickety wooden bed was covered with an old quilt Danielle had sewn herself last year with a map of the United States on it. She had never let him go hungry or without love, but she knew he could feel the tension in the air. The way Caleb would ask, "Mom, do we have enough money for the electricity today?" in a whisper, as if afraid to awaken the monsters of reality. Millstone used to be the place where her father, Eli, was known as the best cookie baker in the South. Parker's Diner once served factory workers, truck drivers, and local politicians. The town used to live, breathe, and be full of laughter and music. But then the textile factory closed. Small shops shut down. The new highway cut through town without stopping. Layers of dust collected on broken windows, as if the town had been forgotten, and those who survived here clung to memories and stubborn pride. Danielle didn't leave when everyone else chose to. Not because she lacked opportunities, but because she couldn't. Not with her father bedridden, not with Caleb still in 3rd grade, and certainly not with the pride that was woven into every brick of the diner her father had built with his own hands. This morning, like every morning, Danielle opened the ledger and diligently calculated. She counted each bill, each material cost, every penny in the tip jar, then paused long at the last line, the electricity bill, overdue by 19 days. Deep inside there was a weariness to her bones, but her eyes still shone bright. The eyes of someone who had once faced premature birth alone, placed her mother's body in a coffin, then quietly returned to wash dishes in the kitchen because no one else was there to take the shift. She took a deep breath, tucked her hastily tied hair behind her ear, and looked out the window. The sky was overcast, a heavy morning like every other morning, but today, she didn't know yet that this day would change everything. Not with the wind of fate, but with a heavy step, the familiar sound of the doorbell, and a man wearing the jacket that everyone feared, except for her. The bell at Parker's Diner rang sharply, slicing through Danielle's thoughts like a blade cutting through the thick silence of the early morning. She instinctively looked up, and time seemed to stop for a moment. The man entering carried the weight of a storm. Tall, broad-shouldered, his worn black leather jacket covered in creases and scratches, as if he had just stepped out from a journey full of dust and turmoil. His salt and pepper hair hung loosely over his ears, his unruly beard making him look even more menacing. But what froze the entire space was the infamous symbol on the back of his jacket, a skull clutching a sickle, with the words, "Hell's Angels, Georgia Chapter," in blood-red letters underneath. For a few seconds, the cozy atmosphere of the diner turned into something taut, like a stretched wire. The 3 customers present, old Tommy Jefferson sitting by the window, the young couple Rick and Donna eating pastries, went silent. Tommy paused mid-spoonful. Rick put his coffee cup down with a loud clink, and Donna gripped her husband's hand tightly. Danielle didn't move. She simply observed the man's every heavy step as he walked in, the sound of his boots hitting the old tile floor echoing like a drumbeat, signaling impending trouble. The man didn't look around. He went straight to the chair closest to the counter, choosing the farthest spot from the others. His broad shoulders hunched, his body hunched as though trying to hide his intimidating figure. That posture, to Danielle, wasn't a threat. It was exhaustion. She walked toward him with the old plastic menu, her hands hidden under her apron, wiping the sweat off surreptitiously. As she drew nearer, she noticed his large, calloused hands were trembling slightly. A thin medical bracelet poked out from his sleeve. Too fragile for such a massive man. And his eyes. Those eyes were the thing that made her freeze. Light blue. Weary. Red-rimmed as if he hadn't slept for many nights. But there was no anger or threat in them, only emptiness. The eyes of a man who had once lived with hope and was now trying to hold on to the last ashes of it. Danielle softened her voice. "Welcome to Parker's Diner. Today's special is southern fried beef with mashed potatoes. If you need something quick, I have egg biscuits and coffee ready." The man nodded slightly, his voice gravelly like a wheel grinding stone. "Coffee. Black, as quick as you can. I've been driving since before dawn." Danielle poured the coffee, setting it down in front of him. When he reached for the cup, his hand shook so badly that the liquid almost spilled over. Danielle noticed the faint initials on his wrist. W.C. Mede. She recognized it as short for Willow Creek Medical Center, a nearby county hospital. "Do you have someone at Willow Creek?" she asked gently. The man didn't respond right away. He stared at the coffee cup for a long time, as if the cup itself held the portal to a place he didn't want to return to. "My daughter, Jessie, 13, end stage." The answer fell into the space like a cold blow. Danielle swallowed hard. As a mother, she didn't need many words to understand. The sleepless nights, the silent prayers, the helplessness in the face of illness. It was all written on the face of this stranger. I'm so sorry," she said, and meant it. Hank nodded, saying nothing. Danielle turned away to hide her reddened eyes. When she called the order to the kitchen, she felt the eyes behind her. Cold, fearful, suspicious. But like so many times in her life, she chose not to look back. That man wasn't the sickle symbol on his jacket. He was a father. Nothing more, nothing less. And no one in this diner, not even her, had the right to forget that. Then the doorbell rang again. But this time, it wasn't the metallic chime welcoming a guest. It was like the air cracking open before the storm arrives. As the bell at Parker's Diner rang, Danielle barely had time to turn around before she felt the air behind her tighten. A strange atmosphere swept in. Not a breeze, but an invisible pressure that made her palms suddenly sweat. She turned and saw them. Sheriff Brent Holloway, in his faded olive-green uniform with frayed edges at the collar and shoulders, his meticulously polished boots as if he had just come from a parade, walked into the diner with a face bearing two distinct expressions, the confidence of someone familiar with power and the smug pleasure of someone about to catch prey. Beside him was Deputy Alicia Monroe, younger, slender, her gaze wavering between professionalism and discomfort, as if she didn't truly want to be there either. Brent took measured steps toward the counter, where Hank still sat quietly with his steaming cup of coffee. Danielle felt her throat go dry, but she held her gaze steady, neither lowering her eyes nor looking away. After all, she had nothing left to lose. "Well, well," Brent said loudly, his voice raspy and drawn out, as though he meant for everyone in the diner to hear. It's been a while since we've seen a special type like this around Millstone." No one laughed. No one spoke. Hank didn't turn his head, nor did he respond. He only tightened his grip on the coffee cup. Danielle saw that movement, not out of fear, but out of endurance. "I'm just here for breakfast," Danielle spoke, her voice calmer than she felt inside. "No trouble, no complaints, just another customer like anyone else." Brent smirked, then leaned one elbow on the counter, clearly invading Hank's personal space. He glanced down at the symbol on the back of Hank's jacket and nodded knowingly. "Hell's Angels, huh? Let me guess. Drugs, guns, theft? Or maybe you're just here to stir up some trouble in this town." The empty accusation was thrown out by Brent like a baited hook. But Hank didn't bite. He simply spoke slowly, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm here because my daughter is dying. I don't have time for power plays." Deputy Alicia blinked, glancing away slightly. Clearly, Hank's words had struck a nerve in her conscience. Danielle couldn't stand it any longer. She dropped the towel she was wiping the counter with, stood up straight, and met Brent's eyes as if looking at a former classmate who had forgotten the reason they wore a uniform. "He hasn't done anything wrong, Brent. This is a diner, not a checkpoint. If you want to arrest someone, you need a clear reason." Brent turned his head, his gaze cutting like a knife. "A clear reason?" he sneered. "You really think that jacket doesn't say anything? Guys wearing death symbols don't come here for biscuits." "I don't see the jacket," Danielle replied flatly. "I see his eyes. His hands are shaking. There's a hospital bracelet on his wrist. He's not here to cause trouble. He just needs a meal, a little compassion." The diner fell silent. Brent sighed, standing up straighter. His eyes scanned the remaining customers, as if to remind them that anyone who sided with Danielle would be marked. He threw one last line. "You're making a mistake. In this town, picking the wrong side can cost you everything." He gestured to Alicia. The young woman looked at Danielle for a long moment, then nodded subtly, a nod filled with guilt, but also silent agreement. She followed Brent out of the diner. The door closed, and the bell rang again. This time, not with sharpness, but with a quiet, choking sound. Danielle let out a breath, then turned back to the counter pouring more coffee for Hank. She spoke softly, her eyes never leaving his hands. "Today's breakfast is on me. You don't have to pay." Hank looked up, surprised. Something in his eyes changed. Not the usual gratitude, but a sense of brokenness being mended. "I'm not here to be pitied," he murmured. "I'm not pitying you," Danielle replied. "I just believe sometimes the right thing to do is to offer a tired person breakfast." Hank was silent. After a long moment he nodded, slowly, heavily. Not because words were lacking, but because for the first time in many days someone treated him like a human. Danielle said nothing more. But she knew. The confrontation had drawn a line, and without hesitation she had chosen the side with fewer people, but the one that was right. Hank sat silently with his steaming cup of coffee in front of him, his gaze fixed on the window misted with the pale light of the morning. Danielle turned back to the counter, beginning to prepare the fried chicken exactly as her father had taught her. Not too hot oil, not too thick meat, and the breadcrumbs must be mixed by hand. The aroma began to fill the air, but instead of drawing a comforting feeling, it was abruptly cut off by the sound of the door opening again. Without looking, the whole diner knew who had just entered. Sheriff Brent Holloway, tall, salt-and-pepper hair slicked back, a face carved from cold stone, his uniform sharp and fully equipped, and a shiny black handgun conspicuously strapped to his left hip. entered with the manner of someone who believed the entire place was his domain. Right behind him was Deputy Alicia Monroe, her face contorted, as though unsure whether she should even be there. Brent didn't greet anyone. He merely swept his eyes across the room, and they immediately fixated on Hank Morrison's worn leather jacket. He walked toward the counter, each step thudding down on the floor, making the air in the diner feel heavier with each beat. "Oh," Brent spoke, his voice tinged with a cold metallic edge. "I didn't expect Millstone to host a Hell's Angel." Hank didn't answer. He kept his hand wrapped around the coffee cup, his eyes never leaving the sunlight outside. The silence clearly irritated Brent. He wasn't used to being ignored. "I asked, are you going to answer?" Brent's voice grew sharper as he pointed at the Hell's Angels logo on Hank's jacket. "Do you know we have orders to monitor anyone wearing this symbol?" His hand lightly brushed against the grip of his gun. Danielle, standing behind the counter with a spoon still in her hand, paused in mid-motion. Hank turned slowly, his voice still even, though it was deeper now. "I'm sitting still, drinking coffee, waiting for breakfast. If this town has a law against having breakfast while wearing a leather jacket, feel free to call your lawyer." Brent sneered. He didn't like being responded to, especially not by someone he'd mentally categorized as scum of society. "I demand identification. Now." Hank calmly unzipped his jacket, reaching inside. But as soon as the movement began, Brent took half a step back, his right hand sliding straight to his gun. It all happened in less than a second, but for Danielle, it felt like the whole world just stopped. She immediately dropped the spoon, stepped out from behind the counter, and stood between Brent and Hank. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, sharp like a thin blade cutting through the air. "Enough. He's a customer. He's not pulling out a gun, he's pulling out a wallet. If there's no official reason, I suggest you leave my diner." Brent halted, his hand still hovering over his gun, his eyes locked on Danielle's face, as if measuring how much she was worth to be crushed. "You're interfering with a police investigation," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm protecting my space, and I don't see anything worth investigating in a man sitting quietly, drinking coffee, and waiting for the meal I'm making." The air was so thick with tension that even the sound of a spoon falling to the floor could have set it off. Alicia, standing behind Brent, finally spoke up, her voice small but firm with embarrassment. "Brent, he hasn't done anything threatening." Brent turned to look at Alicia, and his gaze made it clear to everyone in the diner that this disagreement would not be ignored easily, but he didn't say anything. He just sighed and turned back to Hank. "We'll be keeping an eye on you," he growled. "Hell's Angels have no place in this town." Danielle didn't flinch. She stood firm, like a wall between Hank and Brent. Brent stepped back, his eyes still fixed on Danielle, as if engraving her face into his memory. Then he nodded slightly, not as a greeting, but like an unspoken promise. "You've chosen your side, Danielle." Then he turned, pushing the door open. Alicia looked at Danielle, nodding once more, this time with respect. She followed Brent out, leaving the door to gently swing closed behind them. No one said anything for a few minutes afterward. There was no need to. Everyone knew what had just happened, and what was coming next. Danielle returned to the counter, picked up the spoon for the sauce, and continued her unfinished task. Her hand trembled slightly, but her eyes did not. She hadn't chosen to fight, she just chose not to bow her head. The sound of the doorbell still lingered like a slow final note as Brent Holloway disappeared behind the door. The air in Parker's diner remained thick, as if no one dared to exhale. Danielle stood behind the counter, her hand still gently gripping the stainless steel spoon, her gaze fixed on the door that had just closed. But what sent a chill down her spine was not the heavy footsteps Brent had left behind, but the final look he had given her, a look not filled with immediate anger, but with the implication of a calculated plan for revenge. The diner was silent. No one coughed. No spoon clinked against a porcelain cup. That silence was louder than any judgment. It was the proof of a small community where everyone was afraid of being implicated. Everyone just wanted to live in peace, and Danielle, she had just lost that. Rick, the young man sitting with his wife earlier, leaned forward and stood up. Donna quickly grabbed her purse, not meeting anyone's eyes. Rick placed money on the table, more than what they had eaten, as if trying to buy silence. As he walked past Danielle, he spoke quietly, not exactly reproachful, but sharp enough to cut. "You should be careful. This is Millstone, not Atlanta." They walked out quickly, almost hurriedly, not because they feared Hank, but because they feared what might come next. Tommy Jefferson, the widowed old man, who had come to the diner every week since Eli Parker was still strong, stood up more slowly. He left a coin in his coffee cup and shook his head slightly at Danielle. "Your father was a good man, but these days, being too good can be a burden." Those words chilled Danielle more than any threat. She didn't answer. She just nodded, accepting a sad truth she couldn't fight. The door rang again as he left. Only two people remained, Danielle and Hank Morrison. The large man still sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the street. A light breeze blew through the gap in the door, making the receipt papers on the counter flutter. Danielle stepped out, placing the plate of food in front of him. Crispy fried chicken, smooth mashed potatoes, rich brown gravy, and 2 slices of buttered toast with crisp edges. A simple meal her father used to say, "It might not heal, but at least it'll make you feel worth a full stomach." "No need for many words," Danielle said, her voice soft but firm. "Eat. You're safe here." Hank looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He started eating, as if he'd forgotten the feeling of a hot meal. Danielle returned to the counter, wiping down the table, her mind in turmoil. She knew she had just pulled the rug from under her feet. The reputation of Parker's Diner, the trust of the town, the silent support of the regulars, it all just walked out with Brent Holloway. But strangely, she didn't feel regret. Inside, Danielle felt an unusual calm, as if she had just let go of an umbrella in the storm to stand tall in the rain. No more avoidance, no more trying to please everyone. Just one right choice, even though she would have to pay the price. Hank finished his meal. When he stood up, Danielle was about to say something, but Hank just pulled out a crumpled $20 bill from his wallet and placed it next to the plate. He looked at her with eyes that were warm, yet weary. "Thank you for seeing me. Not the jacket I wear." Danielle smiled faintly, but in her heart she knew that "thank you" was genuine. And for someone who had been ignored by the world, just being seen was a miracle. Hank donned his leather jacket, adjusted his hat, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "If tomorrow you find it troublesome, I won't come back, but Jessie, she needs me, and now I know I need someone to believe in me." Then he walked out, leaving behind a strange void, quiet, unassuming, but heavier than silence, a feeling that something was beginning to move. Danielle took the money, placed the $20 into the cash register, then silently took off her apron. She hung it on the hook and stood for a long moment, looking at the diner's old logo, the faded Parker's Diner, since 1973, where the paint had almost entirely worn away. She knew, since this morning, the diner was no longer just serving coffee and breakfast. It had just chosen a side. And the one leading that side was her. That night, Danielle Parker drifted off to sleep on the old wooden chair behind the counter, her head resting on her shoulder, a thin blanket wrapped around her waist, and the soft yellow glow from the kitchen casting the last warmth of a long day. Though her body was exhausted, she still felt the lingering sense that she had crossed a line, thin as a thread, but sharply dividing right from comfortable. But what she hadn't anticipated was that the price for crossing that line would come swiftly, and colder than she had ever imagined. The next morning, Danielle went to open the diner as usual, but before she could insert the key into the lock, her eyes suddenly froze. A grayish sign was stuck to the window with rough, jagged red paint that looked like blood. No bikers. No troublemakers. Her hand stilled midair. Her heart felt like it was being gripped by someone. The writing was large, messy, and blatantly hostile. A declaration of war directed right at her. No signature. She knew who left it, and she knew. This was no joke. Silently, she peeled the sign off the glass, folded it in half, then again, until the red paint soaked through her hands. She said nothing. No shouting, no anger, but deep in Danielle's eyes something shifted, like dry earth cracking before the first rainfall. The entire morning passed in silence. Not the usual quiet from a lack of customers, but a deliberate emptiness. The regulars who had come every morning, old Joe Larkin with his grandson, Mrs. Miller with her black umbrella, had suddenly vanished, as though they had never existed. In their place were furtive glances from across the street, shadows behind curtains, windows shutting when Danielle walked by. The town didn't need to say anything. Its silence was enough to pass judgment. By noon, a post appeared on Danielle's phone from the Millstone Town social media app, where everything from missing dogs to church events was updated. Owner of Parker's Diner admits to harboring a criminal biker. Who still cares about Millstone's safety? Betrayal entre unsafe. Beneath the post was a photo taken from behind Hank, sitting in the diner, and Danielle placing coffee in front of him. The angle was enough to clearly show the Hell's Angels logo, enough to turn everything into evidence of an accusation, even though there was nothing wrong in the photo. The comments started to flare up like dry grass in the summer. She clearly knew who he was and still let him in? The biker was arrested in Tennessee, and now he's here in Millstone. She's protecting criminals. Parker's Diner is now a hangout for lawless drifters. Danielle didn't respond, didn't delete the post, didn't clarify because she knew they didn't care about the truth. They needed someone to hate, and today that someone was her. In the afternoon, when Caleb came home from school, he hesitantly tugged at his mother's shirt and whispered, "Mom, my teacher asked why you're hanging out with bad people." Danielle froze. Her eyes didn't leave the hand she was wiping the counter with, but her heart felt as if someone had plunged their hand straight into her chest. She had never allowed her troubles to affect Caleb, but this time, everything was beyond control. "Did you say anything?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just said, he's the saddest dad I've ever seen." Danielle gently bent down and hugged her son tightly. Not because he needed it, but because she needed something still warm, something real. As evening fell, Parker's Diner was still as empty as it had been in the morning. Danielle sat alone by the window, the last rays of sunlight casting a soft glow on her cheek, as if trying to comfort her. She opened her phone, scrolling through unanswered messages from suppliers. They reported delays due to public backlash. Some others said they were pausing cooperation to assess the situation. She understood what that meant. The people who had once shaken her hand were now turning away because they too feared being targeted by Brent. She was the only one still standing. That night, as she closed up, Danielle saw something shoved under the door. She bent down and picked it up, a color-printed flyer with a short message. "Millstone doesn't need you. Leave." No one signed it. No one came forward. But to Danielle, no one needed to admit it, because it was the town itself that was executing her with collective cowardice. She stepped out behind the diner and started a small fire in an old metal drum. The paper burned at the edges, the red letters fading into the flames. Danielle watched not with anger, but with cold, steel-like determination. No one in this town understood one thing. Fear had been her companion for a long time, but since yesterday, they were no longer walking the same road. The last embers in the metal drum behind the diner slowly faded, leaving Danielle with an emptiness that could not be filled by silence. Night fell over Millstone, heavy like a dark velvet curtain covering a stage awaiting its final act, but Danielle knew this story was far from over. She locked the diner's door and told Caleb to stay at the neighbor's house, Mrs. Lorraine, the kind widow who occasionally helped look after the boy. Then Danielle drove away from the familiar main street, heading toward the Willow Creek Medical Center, where her father, Eli Parker, had been receiving long-term care after a stroke 3 years ago. The hospital hallway was quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. The cold white glow of the fluorescent lights stretched across the ceiling, casting Danielle's shadow on the polished floor. She stopped in front of room 214, standing for a long while with the door handle in her hand, as if trying to gather the strength she had spent the entire day not to crumble. When she entered, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence like the ticking of a clock, counting the moments left unsaid. Eli lay there, much thinner now, his frail body resembling an unfinished piece of memory from the past, but his eyes were still open, slowly recognizing his daughter. Danielle smiled softly. She pulled a wooden chair closer, sat beside the bed, and gently took his hand. A hand that had once been strong and powerful, now dry and trembling, as if holding on to something only he and she could understand. "Today has been a long day, Dad," Danielle whispered, her thumb lightly stroking the back of his hand, just like he had comforted her when she was hurt as a child. "I know you can't speak, but if you're listening, I'll tell you." And so, in the pale white room, she told him. From the coffee she handed to a man she didn't know the name of, to the moment Brent Holloway reached for his gun, to the hastily written red-painted sign in front of the diner, and the venomous comments online. She recounted every look she received that day, the eyes that had once been friendly, but now avoided her like she carried a plague. And she even told him about Caleb's question about why his mom hung out with bad people. When she reached this point, her voice faltered. Not because she was weak, but because, for the first time, she felt she was fighting without any allies standing behind her. But Eli's hand was still in hers, and strangely it tightened slightly. Danielle took a deep breath, then leaned in closer and whispered into his ear, "I don't regret it, Dad. You taught me to do what's right. And today, what's right is standing by someone who has no one else to stand with." Amid the cold mechanical sounds of medical devices, those words felt like an invisible thread, connecting the past and the present, the roots and the branches, father and daughter. A tear silently fell onto her wrist. It was unclear whether it came from Danielle or from the eyes of the man who could no longer speak. But she felt it, and she understood. Eli knew. He heard, and he agreed. Before leaving, Danielle stood, smoothed his hair, and fixed the blanket that had shifted to one side. Then she bent down and kissed his bony hand, as if performing a sacred ritual just for them. "I know. If it were you, you'd pour him a coffee." He didn't answer, but the heart monitor still beeped steadily. There was still life. There was still memory. Danielle turned off the room light, leaving only the faint glow of the nightlight beside the bed. She walked out into the cold hallway, leaving behind the image of the man who had once been the pillar of an entire community, now a silent pillar for her courage. Out in the parking lot, the night wind had risen. Danielle stood beside the old pickup truck, looking up at the moonless sky. She reminded herself, this was no longer about a stranger in a biker jacket. This was about how a woman, a single mother, chose to keep her father's teachings in her heart, in a world that was telling her to remain silent. And she did not remain silent. Returning from the hospital at dawn, Danielle Parker didn't sleep. She lay still on the old couch behind the kitchen counter, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind racing through 100 thoughts, but her heart held on to just one. She had done the right thing. And if she had to do it again, she would still pour coffee for Hank Morrison, still step between him and the gun Brent Holloway had placed his hand on. As the first light of day began to seep through the diner's window, Danielle stood up, adjusted her shirt, and wiped the grease stains off the kitchen counter, as if she were adjusting herself after a stormy night. Everything still looked the same as yesterday, only different in one way. Today, she was more ready. The diner opened at 6:30, but by 9 a.m., Parker's Diner was still empty. Not the kind of emptiness that comes from a lack of customers, but an intentional void. The regulars who came every morning, Joe Larkin taking his grandson to school, Mrs. Miller with her black umbrella, had suddenly disappeared, as though they had never existed. Instead, there were furtive glances from across the street. Shadows behind curtains. Windows closing when Danielle walked by. The town didn't need to say anything. Its silence was enough to pass judgment. By noon, a post appeared on Danielle's phone from the Millstone Town social media app, where everything from missing dogs to church events was updated. The owner of Parker's Diner is harboring a criminal biker who still cares about the safety of Millstone. Betrayal. Unsafe. Below the post was a candid photo taken from behind Hank, sitting in the diner, and Danielle placing coffee in front of him. The angle was enough to clearly show the Hell's Angels logo, enough to turn everything into evidence of an accusation, even though there was no wrongdoing in the photo. The comments started to flare up like dry grass in the summer. She clearly knew who he was, and still let him in. The biker was arrested in Tennessee, and now he's here in Millstone. She's protecting criminals. Parker's Diner is now a hangout for lawless drifters. Danielle didn't respond. Didn't delete the post, didn't clarify, because she knew they didn't care about the truth. They needed someone to hate, and today that someone was her. In the afternoon, when Caleb came home from school, the boy shyly tugged at his mother's shirt and whispered, "Mom, my teacher asked why you're hanging out with bad people." Danielle froze. Her eyes didn't leave the hand she was wiping the counter with, but her heart felt as if someone had thrust their hand into her chest. She had never let her personal issues affect Caleb, but this time, everything was beyond control. "Did you say anything?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just said, he's the saddest dad I've ever seen." Danielle gently bent down and hugged her son tightly, not because he needed it, but because she needed something still warm, something real. As evening fell, Parker's Diner was still as empty as it had been in the morning. Danielle sat alone by the window, the last rays of sunlight casting a soft glow on her cheek, as if trying to comfort her. She opened her phone, scrolling through unanswered messages from suppliers. They reported delays due to public backlash. Some others said they were pausing cooperation to assess the situation. She understood what that meant. The people who had once shaken her hand were now turning away because they too feared being targeted by Brent. She was the only one still standing. That night, as she closed up, Danielle saw something shoved under the door. She bent down and picked it up. A color-printed flyer with a short message. "Millstone doesn't need you. Leave." No one signed it. No one came forward. But to Danielle, no one needed to admit it, because it was the town itself that was executing her with collective cowardice. She stepped out behind the diner and started a small fire in an old metal drum. The paper burned at the edges, the red letters fading into the flames. Danielle watched not with anger, but with cold, steel-like determination. No one in this town understood one thing. Fear had been her companion for a long time, but since yesterday, they were no longer walking the same road. The next morning, Danielle went to open the diner as usual. But before she could insert the key into the lock, her eyes froze. A grayish sign was stuck to the window, with rough, jagged red paint that looked like blood. No bikers. No troublemakers. Her hand stilled midair. Her heart felt like it was being gripped by someone. The writing was large, messy, and blatantly hostile. A declaration of war directed right at her. No signature. She knew who left it, and she knew this was no joke. Silently, she peeled the sign off the glass, folded it in half, then again, until the red paint soaked through her hands. She said nothing. No shouting, no anger, but deep in Danielle's eyes something shifted, like dry earth cracking before the first rainfall. Returning from the hospital at dawn, Danielle Parker didn't sleep. She lay still on the old couch behind the kitchen counter, her eyes fixed on the weathered ceiling, her mind racing through 100 thoughts, but her heart held on to just one. She had done the right thing. And if she had to do it again, she would still pour coffee for Hank Morrison, still step between him and the gun that Brent Holloway had placed his hand on. As the first light of day began to seep through the diner's window, Danielle stood up, adjusted her shirt, and wiped the grease stains off the kitchen counter. As if she were adjusting herself after a stormy night, everything still looked the same as yesterday, only different in one way. Today, she was more ready. The diner opened at 6:30, but by 9 a.m., Parker's diner was still empty. Not the kind of emptiness that comes from a lack of customers, but an intentional void. The regulars who came every morning, Joe Larkin taking his grandson to school, Mrs. Miller with her black umbrella, had suddenly disappeared, as though they had never existed. Instead, there were furtive glances from across the street, shadows behind curtains, windows closing when Danielle walked by. The town didn't need to say anything. Its silence was enough to pass judgment. By noon, a post appeared on Danielle's phone from the Millstone Town social media app, where everything from missing dogs to church events was updated. The owner of Parker's Diner is harboring a criminal biker. Who still cares about the safety of Millstone? Betrayal. Unsafe. Below the post was a candid photo taken from behind Hank sitting in the diner, and Danielle placing coffee in front of him. The angle was enough to clearly show the Hell's Angels logo, enough to turn everything into evidence of an accusation, even though there was no wrongdoing in the photo. The comments started to flare up like dry grass in the summer. She clearly knew who he was and still let him in. The biker was arrested in Tennessee, and now he's here in Millstone. She's protecting criminals. Parker's Diner is now a hangout for lawless drifters. Danielle didn't respond, didn't delete the post, didn't clarify because she knew. They didn't care about the truth. They needed someone to hate. And today, that someone was her. In the afternoon, when Caleb came home from school, the boy shyly tugged at his mother's shirt and whispered, "Mom, my teacher asked why you're hanging out with bad people." Danielle froze. Her eyes didn't leave the hand she was wiping the counter with, but her heart felt as if someone had thrust their hand into her chest. She had never let her personal issues affect Caleb, but this time, everything was beyond control. "Did you say anything?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just said, he's the saddest dad I've ever seen." Danielle gently bent down and hugged her son tightly. Not because he needed it, but because she needed something still warm, something real. As evening fell, Parker's Diner was still as empty as it had been in the morning. Danielle sat alone by the window, the last rays of sunlight casting a soft glow on her cheek, as if trying to comfort her. She opened her phone, scrolling through unanswered messages from suppliers. They reported delays due to public backlash. Some others said they were pausing cooperation to assess the situation. She understood what that meant. The people who had once shaken her hand were now turning away because they too feared being targeted by Brent. She was the only one still standing. That night, as she closed up, Danielle saw something shoved under the door. She bent down and picked it up, a color-printed flyer with a short message. "Millstone doesn't need you. Leave." No one signed it. No one came forward. But to Danielle, no one needed to admit it, because it was the town itself that was executing her, with collective cowardice. She stepped out behind the diner and started a small fire in an old metal drum. The paper burned at the edges, the red letters fading into the flames. Danielle watched, not with anger, but with cold, steel-like determination. No one in this town understood one thing. Fear had been her companion for a long time, but since yesterday, they were no longer walking the same road. The next morning, Danielle went to open the diner as usual. But before she could insert the key into the lock, her eyes froze. A grayish sign was stuck to the window, with rough, jagged red paint that looked like blood. No bikers, no troublemakers. Her hand stilled midair. Her heart felt like it was being gripped by someone. The writing was large, messy, and blatantly hostile. A declaration of war directed right at her. No signature. She knew who left it, and she knew this was no joke. Silently, she peeled the sign off the glass, folded it in half, then again, until the red paint soaked through her hands. She said nothing. No shouting, no anger. But deep in Danielle's eyes something shifted, like dry earth cracking before the first rainfall. Then, an hour later, Millstone began to shake. Not from an earthquake, but from the roar. A sound not from nature, not like the usual rumble of trucks. It had rhythm, it had layers, it had a drumbeat like an army marching in. Danielle was pouring coffee, her hand pausing midair. The cups on the shelf vibrated slightly. A long vroom echoed from a distance, reverberating through the main street like thunder rolling over the ground. She stepped outside, opened the glass door, and saw something Millstone had never witnessed in over 100 years. From both ends of Main Street, small black dots gradually turned into gleaming metallic shapes, then into people. Bikers in leather jackets, flags, and logos from various Hells Angels chapters, from neighboring states like Alabama, Mississippi, and even Carolina. Almost 200 of them, each one like a cog in a massive machine. Every motorcycle stopped in perfect synchronization, forming a straight line. No one spoke, no one broke rank, no one acted impulsively. But it was the orderliness that made the townspeople more afraid than the roar. People spilled out onto the street. From the barber shop porch to the old pharmacy balcony, people gaped down at the street covered in leather, gasoline, and disciplined silence. Mrs. Miller pulled back her window curtain, leaving only her eyes visible. The Jones kids sat on the front steps, breathless, watching the crowd pour in like a flood. And it all stopped in front of Parker's Diner. Danielle stepped onto the stoop, standing tall. Inside, she wasn't afraid, but deeply amazed, as if seeing a storm choose her as its epicenter. One man stepped out from the front row. Tall, wearing a plain black jacket, a shaved head, a white beard, and a voice as deep as coal, shaped into words. "You're Danielle Parker?" "Yes," Danielle replied without hesitation. The man nodded. "I'm Marcus Turner, president of the Grim Reapers, Riverside chapter." She didn't immediately react. Hank had mentioned the name before, but she hadn't expected to meet him today, and in this near-legendary circumstance. Marcus extended his hand, gloved fingers thick and warm. "You gave my brother, Hank, something no one here dared give: respect." Danielle shook his hand, and for the first time in many days she didn't feel like the smallest person in the room. Marcus turned back, signaling. Immediately, the entire convoy cut their engines, leaving a silence that was louder than the roar. Then, one by one, they dismounted. They weren't noisy, they weren't shouting. They simply walked, slow, orderly, heading toward Parker's Diner like pilgrims to a sacred ground. Some brought flowers. Others carried small flags with the words, "Respect the kind," and a few brought food supplies, bags of coffee, bread, deli meat, things typically seen in community outreach. Danielle gasped, not because of the number of people, but because of the meaning. She turned to Marcus and asked softly, "All of this, for a meal?" Marcus smiled, a cracked but strong smile. "No, Miss Parker, for an attitude, for the way you stood up for someone the whole town was willing to reject. In our world, anyone who stands alone for what's right won't stand alone for long." From across the street, Brent Holloway appeared, standing at a distance, still in his police uniform, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed as if trying to pierce through every leather jacket in front of him. But this time, no one in the crowd feared him, and he knew it. Alicia Monroe followed, her eyes different, no longer hesitant, but quietly respectful. Danielle stepped one step onto the stoop, then spoke, her voice loud but not harsh. "I don't know what to prepare for 200 people, but if you don't mind, I can start frying eggs." Laughter erupted. Not loud, not aggressive, but deep, full, and real. The crowd of bikers clapped, patted each other on the back, and began filling up Parker's Diner, a place now both a dining hall and a front line. On the roof across the street, a small flag with a skull and wings fluttered in the morning breeze. And in this town that had once been as silent as a cemetery, for the first time in many years, the sound of faith was returning. After the raucous laughter and thunderous handshakes full of camaraderie, Marcus Turner turned to Danielle, tilting his head toward the open door, greeting the early sunlight and the strong breeze from Main Street. "A small truck will be here in a few minutes. Don't worry. We're not here to eat for free. Roy and Linda called all your suppliers yesterday. All the costs for today have already been paid in advance." Danielle froze. Not because of the money. She hadn't even imagined how much it would cost to serve over 200 people, but because of how everything had been arranged so perfectly, so quietly. No one was bragging, No one was demanding. It was simply support, as if gratitude itself could be organized and disciplined. Just then, the sound of a truck horn came from behind the diner. Danielle ran around to the back door and saw two small trucks reversing into the parking lot. Their truck beds opening to reveal eggs, bacon, sausages, whole loaves of bread, premium coffee beans, cooking oil, fresh vegetables, and even a crate of packaged pastries. 3 burly bikers were already in the back, jumping into the truck beds, passing crates down, one even wearing a white chef's hat and gloves, asking the diner's old head cook, "How many ovens of eggs do you need at once?" Danielle laughed, the first time in days without the bitter taste of exhaustion. She turned around, waving to the friends she had once thought had turned their backs. Mrs. Lorraine from next door arrived, carrying Caleb, wearing her old apron. Will from the church also came by, bringing 5 young volunteers. No one asked, "What's going on?" They just got to work. They came because they saw the lights on in the diner, and something inside told them today was the time to stand together. Inside Parker's diner, the unimaginable started to happen. A biker with a beard and patched-up leather jacket was playing chess with Mrs. Harriet Dawson, the elderly woman who had once opposed letting those bikers into the town. Both were focused, heads bowed over the chessboard, while Mrs. Harriet grumbled, "You move there. I've got you in check, you bearded man." The biker burst out laughing. "Then take my bike while you're at it, ma'am." At another table, a girl with pink hair, wearing black glasses and tattoos covering both arms, was showing Caleb how to build a model motorcycle out of paper and straws. The boy's eyes were wide, his mouth open as if he had just found the real-life version of a superhero. "You've ridden through the Appalachian Range?" the girl asked, "across 3 states without stopping. Were you scared?" Caleb asked softly. The girl tilted her head, a brief but gentle smile. "Yes, but being scared doesn't mean you stop." Danielle watched this from behind the counter, her heart tightening, but not from worry, but from emotion. Brent Holloway was still standing across the street, arms crossed, his eyes glinting with barely concealed displeasure. From his position, the diner he had once threatened was transforming into a place he couldn't control. Deputy Alicia Monroe, walking behind him, looked at the packed diner, then turned to Brent, her gaze no longer conflicted but clearer than ever. She turned on her heel, crossed the street, pushed open the door of Parker's diner, and entered like a guest rather than a subordinate. Danielle looked up, and the 2 women's eyes met. No words were spoken. Danielle poured a cup of coffee, placed it on the counter and nodded. Alicia took the cup, sat down. No words needed. But the gesture resonated louder than any statement. Today, people were choosing sides. Outside, along the entire street, the townspeople began to step out of their doorways, some crossing the street, some standing still. No one threw stones, no one shouted. But their gazes started to change. From horror to curiosity, then suspicion, and finally consideration. And then, the first ones crossed the street. Malik, Danielle's old schoolmate, his hair now streaked with gray, walked straight into the diner, glancing around at the black, white, and Latino bikers, then chuckling softly. "Still got any butter cookies, or should I just munch on tattoos?" Laughter erupted. Danielle tilted her head and pointed to the corner of the counter. "The usual spot, but now you'll have to share the table with someone who knows how to use a cleaver, not just a fork." Malik winked. "As long as she doesn't cut my benefits." Somehow, between a conservative town and a group of bikers branded as outlaws, something had shifted. Not by speeches, not by victories, but by a cup of coffee, a nod, and a place to sit together, Parker's diner that morning wasn't just a diner, it was a statement. And Danielle, a black single mother shunned by the town, was the one who opened the first door for that. Laughter, the scent of hot food, and the sound of stories that seemed impossible to share all filled the air at Parker's diner. Danielle stood behind the counter, still wiping a glass, but her mind was caught in an odd feeling, as if she were witnessing a dream, one she never dared to dream too big. The door to the diner opened again, not hurried, not loud, but every sound in the room immediately stopped. No one had to say anything. Marcus Turner walked in, slowly, like a ritual, as if he knew the weight of every step he was taking. His black leather jacket gleamed, broad shoulders, a square jaw, and short white hair. But what captured everyone's attention wasn't just his appearance. It was the patch sewn on the back of his jacket. President, Grim Reapers, MQ, Riverside, Chapter. He walked forward, the light from the window casting a halo across his nose, almost as if it was an aura of authority. In his hand, he held an old, worn leather cap, not to wear, but as a symbol of tradition. He nodded slightly to Danielle and then looked around the diner, from the bikers in leather jackets to Mrs. Harriet Dawson, Caleb, and even Melek, who was arranging the cookies. He raised his hand and waved, not too big, not prolonged, but immediately the room went silent as if a commander had given the signal. Marcus took a deep breath and spoke, his voice thick, resonating and deep like a drum in the middle of a harvest field. I know many of you in this room, and the town has heard stories about us. Stories from the press, from the police, from people who've never asked us directly. But today, I'm not here to explain about Grim Reapers. I'm here to talk about one person, a person who did what an entire community chose not to do. He turned toward Danielle, lifting his head slightly as a gesture of respect before swearing. She poured coffee for my brother when others pulled guns. She held the door open when the whole town put up a no-entry sign. And when they called her a traitor, she answered with a hot breakfast and a steady gaze. Marcus turned back to the whole room. From today, Parker's Diner is our friend, and anyone who touches this place touches all of my brothers. A second of silence, then an explosion. The sound of applause rumbled like thunder through the small diner. Boots stomped on the floor, whistles echoed, and hands clapped loudly. Even the townspeople who were still unfamiliar with the scene couldn't help but be swept into the energy. Mrs. Harriet slapped the table, her eyes moist. Caleb hugged Danielle from behind. Danielle stood frozen, not out of surprise, but out of emotion. For the first time in many years of carrying burdens, she wasn't alone in standing against it all. And the most absurd thing was, the people defending her today weren't the police or the mayor, but the very ones society labeled as dangerous. Marcus wasn't done. He waited for the crowd to quiet down, then turned his head toward the window where Brent Holloway stood across the street, his expression darkening as he saw that things had spiraled out of control. Marcus turned back and continued, this time not looking at Danielle or any of the bikers. His eyes locked straight at the door, as if he knew exactly who was listening. If anyone in this town, no matter who they are, no matter their position, intends to make life difficult for Parker's Diner because of what's happened, let me be clear, they won't be facing just a woman named Danielle Parker. They'll be facing a family, a crew, a community, a shared heart. There was no roar, no threats, just a statement, clear, precise, no room for doubt. At the counter, Danielle still couldn't speak. She just wiped the corner of her eyes. Caleb looked up at his mother, not fully understanding everything that had just happened, but feeling one thing for sure. Today, Mom was no longer alone. Alicia Monroe, sitting at the counter, gently set her coffee cup down. She exhaled, then, without looking toward Brent outside, said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "If anyone needs a witness, I stand with her." The diner erupted again. In Danielle's heart, for the first time, Millstone became a place she could call home, without needing to redraw the map of right and wrong. She never wanted to lead. She only wanted to protect a stranger, believing that everyone deserved to sit down and have a decent breakfast. Little did she know, that very act would redraw the power dynamics of an entire town. As the laughter died down and the atmosphere inside Parker's diner returned to a gentler rhythm, the coffee bubbling in the pot, the sound of eggs sizzling in the pan, the clinking of knives and spoons like a simple, harmonious melody, Danielle Parker still couldn't quite believe what had just happened. She had just experienced a morning that, only a day ago, she would have called impossible. The town of Millstone had witnessed a declaration that shook the very power structure that had existed through fear, and the one making that declaration stood by her. She was drying her hands behind the kitchen counter when the doorbell rang again. Not the lively, grand sound of the bikers from earlier, but one that made her stop mid-motion with just a single note. Danielle looked up, and then she saw Hank Morrison. He no longer wore the worn black leather jacket. Today, Hank was dressed in a neatly pressed checkered shirt, jeans that weren't covered in dust like usual, his hair combed back, and his beard trimmed. But more than anything, what stood out was his eyes. Still, the eyes that had once been filled with despair, with longing, with loss. But now, there was something new in them. Hope. Danielle stepped out from behind the counter, meeting him in the middle of the room, exactly where Marcus had stood earlier. Hank looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. The smile of a father holding good news, afraid to break it when it's finally spoken aloud. "Jessie." His voice caught in his throat. "The girl, she's showing signs of responding to treatment." Danielle's hand instinctively went to cover her mouth, her eyes wide, as if hearing a miracle. "The doctors won't say for sure, but today, for the first time in 3 weeks, the swelling numbers have started to stabilize. They're going to continue with the new treatment plan, but there's hope, Danielle. There's a real chance." Danielle couldn't hold back. She walked over, embracing Hank tightly as if he were her own flesh and blood. The hug wasn't tentative, it wasn't polite. It was deep, firm, and full of tears. I didn't think one small action could change so much," she whispered through her tears. Hank replied, his hand patting her back gently, a gesture from a man who had once been alone, now finding a place of support. "It didn't just change me, it changed my daughter, my whole family." When they pulled apart, Hank took a small folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He handed it to Danielle with both hands, as if it were something sacred. "Jessie wrote this. She said she wanted to send it to you." Danielle unfolded it. The paper was off-white like school stationery. The handwriting was slightly shaky but clear and heartfelt. A message that pierced her heart. "I'm Jessie. I heard Dad talk about you. He said you didn't run away. You saw him as a person, not his jacket, not his past, not the way people look at him. I haven't met you, but I want to grow up to be someone like you." At the bottom was a crude drawing made with a ballpoint pen. A black woman, standing in the middle of a small diner, arms spread wide, with a line of motorcycles neatly lined up behind her. Danielle hugged the paper to her chest. She didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly, her tears falling silently, but her lips curved into a smile. At that moment, outside the window, Brent Holloway was still standing, quietly observing. But unlike before, this time his gaze was no longer cold and arrogant. It contained something that had never existed in his eyes before: confusion. He witnessed the little diner not being crushed, but growing with every passing minute, not because of money, but because of kindness, not with weapons, but with community. And he, who had once controlled this town through fear, was now becoming invisible among people who no longer bowed their heads. Inside the diner, Danielle folded the letter and placed it in the old wooden drawer next to the counter, right beside the photo of her father in his youth, wearing his military uniform. Between two generations, one a soldier who had gone to battle, and a young girl fighting for life, she stood in the middle, the invisible bridge connecting what needed to be preserved: dignity, trust, and resilience. She looked around the diner, where a white man in a biker jacket was teaching Mrs. Harriet to use a touch screen, where Alicia was playing puzzles with Caleb, where laughter, the smell of food, and the stories of lives collided without anyone being excluded. This was what she had dreamed of, but had never dared to believe it would become reality. As the soft evening light filtered through the window of Parker's diner, casting a warm golden streak across the old tiled floor, Danielle still held Jessie's handwritten letter close to her chest, as if afraid that if she let go, this beautiful moment would vanish. The scrawled drawing, the clumsy handwriting, and the image of the 13-year-old girl fighting hour by hour, all of it remained in her heart like a small candle burning brightly in a room that had once been dark. That was when Roy and Linda Morrison walked in again, quietly, without fanfare. Just two weathered, hardened, and once grieving souls, now bringing with them an unexpected gift. Linda gave Danielle a gentle hug, the kind of hug from a woman who has lost so much. She's no longer afraid to show emotion. Roy silently placed a small brown leather-wrapped package on the counter, his face trying to hide some emotion that was on the verge of breaking through. "It's from Hank," Roy said. "And from all of us." Danielle touched the leather-wrapped package. It was soft, firm, and cool to the touch, like a promise. When she opened it, she froze. In her hands was a real biker jacket, meticulously sewn with every stitch. The back was embroidered with a clear, powerful message: Parker's Diner, friend of the Reapers, protected. Below that was a smaller embroidered patch, shaped like a simple shield, with just one word: protected. Danielle bit her lip, clutching the jacket to her chest like holding a victory that no one else could fully understand, because it didn't come from triumph, but from standing firm in the face of doubt. Linda took out a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to Danielle with both hands, her expression serious, as if she were handing over a sacred relic. "Hank wrote this at midnight. He wants you to keep it." Danielle opened it. The handwriting was slanted and bold, some parts trembling, but every line was clear, like a voice speaking in the stillness of the night. "Danielle, thank you. Not for the coffee, not for the breakfast, but because you saw me, not the jacket, not the past, not what others say about me. You saw the father in me, and Jessie, she's smiling again. Today," she said, "I want to give her a hug. I hope for that day, but until then, I hope you keep this jacket as a promise that you'll never stand alone again. Hank Morrison." Danielle stood still, her hands trembling slightly. She folded the paper back up, pressed it against her heart, and whispered softly, "He doesn't know. I've always wished someone would say that to me." She turned toward the kitchen corner, where a photo of her father, Eli Parker, hung on the wall since the diner had opened. In the photo, he wore his old apron, smiling brightly next to the bakery oven, with the words, "Every loaf is a promise to the customer," written behind him. Next to that photo was a vacant hook, used only to hang the apron at the end of the day. Danielle lifted the biker jacket and carefully hung it up. When she let go, the jacket swayed gently, right next to the photo of her father and his faded apron. Two symbols, the past and the present, tradition and rebellion, bloodlines and new blood, now hung side by side, like a quiet but steadfast affirmation. Kindness has no fixed shape, and honor doesn't always come from the accepted uniforms. Linda gently squeezed Danielle's shoulder, whispering, "Hank says, if someday Jessie gets better, she wants to come here for butter cookies." Danielle laughed through her tears. "She'll have a whole batch baked fresh, with her name on each one." From outside, the evening light slanted through the large window frame, casting its glow across the leather jacket hanging on the wall, making the words "Friend of the Reapers" gleam with a bright silver flash. And in that light, Danielle realized something she had never dared to put into words. She hadn't just kept her father's diner going. She had turned it into something greater. A fortress with no walls, no soldiers, no guns, but invincible, because it was built on courage. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the windows of Parker's diner, casting slanted light onto the leather jacket hanging next to the picture of Eli Parker and the old apron. Three symbols, loyalty, family memory, and courage, silently told the story of a journey that even those involved never dared believe they had made. Danielle was wiping down the counter while gazing up at the fading light of the evening. The diner was now empty, but it wasn't the emptiness of isolation. It was the quiet of new beginnings. And then the doorbell rang. No one needed to look to know who had just entered. Brent Holloway, the sheriff of Millstone, no longer carried the aura of power he once wore like armor. Today, he wasn't accompanied by Deputy Alicia Monroe. No crisp uniform, no confident stride or heavy footsteps. Brent wore a faded gray shirt, old jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low, as if hiding something in his eyes. Danielle saw him the moment the door opened, but she didn't flinch, didn't step back, and didn't change her expression. She stood still behind the counter, still holding the steel coffee pot. Brent didn't say a word. He walked slowly toward the counter where the last empty seat was, the very spot where Hank Morrison had sat on the first day. No one in the diner looked up. No one whispered. No eyes turned toward him. But the atmosphere became thick, as if the whole room was holding its breath. Brent pulled out the chair and sat down. His hand rested on the table, not near his hip, the place where his gun used to be. Danielle walked over. She didn't ask, didn't greet, didn't offer a menu. She simply poured the coffee. The ceramic mug was placed down so gently that it made no sound. She turned away immediately and continued wiping the counter. No words passed between them, only the soft hum of the diner, the clinking of knives and forks, the stirring of spoons and cups, and the slow breaths of a town that had just learned to let go of its fear. Brent didn't look up. He just sat there, his hand wrapped around the coffee cup as if trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth left in his roll. Danielle didn't need to look at him to know. The man who had once controlled this town with silence was now drowning in that very silence. In that moment, no gunshots, no threats, no humiliation, was when power shifted, not from one person to another, but from fear to compassion. And the person truly holding the power in that moment was the black woman in an apron, holding a coffee pot and not bowing her head. Brent looked up, his eyes searching for some expression on Danielle's face, anger, reproach, or at least disdain. But all he saw was a silent pride. She didn't need to say she had won. She didn't need him to lose. She just needed him to realize arrogance no longer had a place here. A moment later, Brent placed a $5 bill on the counter and stood up. No one saw him off. No one looked after him. He left like a stranger, not the sheriff, not a person of power. Just a man walking out of a world he once thought he owned. Danielle stayed behind the counter. Her hand gripped the cloth lightly. Not out of tension, but because a very real emotion was rising. A cold sense of reassurance, like after a great storm, knowing she didn't have to scream to survive. She looked up at the leather jacket hanging on the wall. The embroidered word, "protected," glinted in the sunset light. No one needed to say anything more. Because now, everything was clear. Brent's false authority had been defeated by steadfastness, a cup of coffee, and uncompromising compassion. A few weeks later, Parker's Diner wasn't just busy, it had become a destination. It was no longer just a local diner where a few old men played chess and farmers ate meat pies. Now, it was a place of convergence for all. Bikers, pastors, college students, the elderly, single mothers, even those who had left Millstone because they felt they didn't belong. People from Atlanta drove 3 hours just to take pictures next to the Friend of the Reapers sign. A local newspaper called it the nicest diner in America. On social media, images of the leather jacket with the word "protected" next to Eli Parker's oil-stained apron spread like wildfire, accompanied by the hashtag, "Danielle did not flinch." And in the very place that had once been the heart of her isolation, it had now become a community of healing. Mrs. Harriet Dawson, who once clutched her purse tightly when Hank walked in, was now baking butter cookies twice a week, teaching 3 bikers how to pinch the edges of the cookies right. Pastor Andrews often sat at the back of the diner on Saturdays, sharing the Bible with a group of bikers clad in leather, tattoos covering both arms. They called it the Unexpected Angels Fellowship. The girl with pink hair taught Caleb how to paint motorcycle models and stitch leather, and the boy, once shy, now boldly declared in class, "My mom's not just a diner owner, she's the one who doesn't fear anyone." And Danielle, the single mother once shunned by the town, was now the living symbol of something once considered a luxury. The strength of community beginning with individual kindness. She still wore the old apron, still poured coffee, but every time she turned away, someone was watching. Not because she was doing something extraordinary, but because she did what was right when everyone else chose silence. When the press asked her the secret to changing the whole town, Danielle just smiled. "I didn't change the town, I just didn't bow my head, and when you stand tall long enough sometimes, others will start to stand with you." Her father, Eli Parker, still lay in room 214, but each time Danielle visited, she told him about the new things happening, about the jacket hanging next to his photo, about the kids riding their bikes around the diner, about Jesse, who was getting better, learning to speak again after chemotherapy, and would be coming in soon for butter cookies. Each time, his hand still squeezed hers. No words, just the rhythm of his heartbeat. On one of the rare afternoons when the diner was quiet, Danielle stood by the glass door, looking out onto the street. On Main Street, she saw things she had never seen before. A town starting to look at each other with different eyes. No longer guarded, no longer divided, but with recognition, sometimes silently, but always genuinely. Millstone wasn't a paradise yet, but it was learning to rebuild. And at the heart of that journey wasn't the town hall, wasn't the police station, wasn't the big church. It was a small diner, with a black woman standing behind the counter, a single mother, a coffee pot, and a heart that didn't bow. And as the evening sunlight slanted through the window, casting its glow on the silver-embroidered words on the leather jacket hanging on the wall, Protected. Danielle smiled. Because now she knew. True power doesn't come from making others bow their heads. True power is when you stand tall and make others want to stand tall with you. Could a black woman, a single mother, a small diner, and a cup of coffee change a whole town? Danielle Parker proved, yes, it could. She had no power, no backing, but she had something stronger than all, the courage to not bow down to injustice. And from one simple act of kindness in the storm of prejudice, she didn't just save a father, she healed an entire community. Parker's Diner was no longer just a diner. It had become a symbol of unwavering kindness. What do you think? If you were Danielle in that situation, would you have the courage to stand up, even if it meant standing alone? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this video if you believe in the power of compassion, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next inspiring stories. Thank you for joining us. And remember, sometimes a cup of coffee can change the world.